What if recognizing your limits could actually create clarity and help you grow? In this episode, I talk with experimental psychologist and creativity expert Mario Varvoglis. Mario shares how creativity isn't about constant output, but about learning to alternate between divergent and convergent thinking, finding your rhythm, and using structure to bring ideas to life. We also explore the timing of life, how embracing constraints can spark urgency, and why, in the age of AI, our edge is still our humanity. Welcome to Building Thinkers. Mario, if you would start with a bit of your story, what brought you to the work that you're doing today?
So I was born in the States. I left when I was 6 years old, and I grew up in Greece. So Greece was a very different place from the United States at that time. And when I finished high school, I went back to the States for my undergraduate and graduate studies, and ended up with a PhD in experimental psychology. And while doing my graduate studies, and also after that, I was working in laboratories, research laboratories, doing research on what we call exceptional human experience. Somehow I ended up in France, where I had never been. So I had to adapt to a new culture once again. And there I realized that my subject matter, which was psychical research, basically, what we call psychic phenomena or exceptional human experience, that just doesn't exist here. There is no room for it here because it's not academically recognized as a field. So I had to make a shift, but I didn't abandon it. I maintained my research interests, and I ended up becoming president of the one and only research foundation on that field in France, in Paris. So I continued as president, but at the time, this long time ago, the turn of the century, we'll say, I went into innovation and creativity. Some of the research that we were doing in the laboratory involved altered states of consciousness, and especially what we call the hypnagogic state, which is the kind of state that's in transition between sleeping and waking. It turns out to be a very receptive state, a very state where we're kind of between two worlds and lots of interesting things are happening. It's kind of like there's a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious in that state. So I was interested in that. And at the time when I came to France, I said, well, it seemed to be a very creative state. So even if I can't study what interests me here in France, I'll study that state and creativity. But as things turned out, I ended up going for creativity in organizations, becoming a consultant, rather than doing academic creativity, so to speak. So when you go into organizations, you can't ask people to go to sleep, close their eyes, or anything like that, especially back then. You just don't do that. So I learned the other approach to creativity, which is eyes wide open and through interactions between individuals and kind of forcing the brain to make new links, as opposed to counting on that natural capacity we have during sleep and during dreams and so forth, what we call incubation. That was my second career, is in addition to what I continue doing as a research, I went into innovation and creativity for companies. And for 20 plus years, 25 years, I've been doing training and facilitation of sessions and consulting and coaching of board of directors and so forth in major organizations, basically. And then one of the creativity techniques, quite well known actually, is design thinking. I was kind of surprised to discover that design thinking somewhere in the States at Stanford University was being applied not for new products only, not for new services, but was actually being applied to the development of people, and namely professional development, career development, development for graduate students how to think of their own future and so forth. So this was kind of bringing together my interest in people and my interest in creativity in a much tighter way. And so I decided to go there, to go to Stanford, get my first training as a coach, a designing your life coach, and then I took it further and I got a certification to be a partner, full partner for Europe, namely for France and a few countries around here, for designing your life.
Oh, that's remarkable, Mario. How incredible. And one of the questions that we ask is, what is it that you build? And so you shared before we started recording that question prompted some reflection, and you said, love to hear a little bit about that.
I build, to answer your question, mindset shifts, changes in the way people see things. And that's true, of course, with designing your life, because designing your life is all about how to kind of shift your mindset from one that says, okay, I set a goal and I have to go get that goal, and that's it. I have my GPS here, and I have to follow the right steps and get as efficient as possible to get to my goal. Now, that's kind of the normal way of thinking, whether it's individuals or teams or organizations. It's go for it and go as directly as possible. And designing your life is a bit different. It's saying every once in a while, at least, you have to stop, look at yourself, look at where you're at right now, kind of update, because sometimes we're still working with goals and stories that we've inherited from our past, even from our parents. So every once in a while, you have to stop, revisit where you're at, and kind of update your compass and say, where is it really that I want to go? And instead of defining a goal and objectives, instead of moving according to goal, you move according to your compass. Then I realized that going back into my creativity career, that, well, that's about mindset shift too, as well, because it's about taking teams and organizations and people and saying, look, creativity is not just for creative people, natural, born creative people. Creativity is just a way of thinking. It's a way of addressing problems and addressing novelty and change. And you can learn it. I mean, it's not a big deal. Just the way we learn how to become rational thinkers, we can learn the basic rules of creativity. And there are rules. And then I went back to parapsychology and psychical research. And I said, well, that's the biggest mindset shift of all, because basically psychical research challenges the very way, the manner in which we look at the world today, the manner in which we think of what is individuality. It really challenges things at a very, very deep level, which is the reason that it's very difficult for science, let's say conventional science, to stomach that. It's just overturning so many things so quickly that some scientists, not all, but some who take it upon themselves to define the orthodoxy, consider that these phenomena are impossible. Something like precognition or telepathy or whatever are impossible, and therefore they do not exist. And that's a mindset. That is a belief system. The common theme in what I build across my three interests and careers is helping people see other than what they have been seeing all along, so to speak. So maybe a simpler way of saying it is installing doubt, just making you a little bit doubtful of your certitudes. That's my favorite.
Yeah. Oh, wow, Mario. There's so much to dig in on. I have to make some decisions here. Okay. Maybe we start with diving in a little bit more around creativity. I also do work in both the academic space and with companies. And oftentimes I'm at some of these same intersection points around creativity, innovation, mindset shift. And I'm curious of your perspective, if we could start around creativity. One of the things that you said in your notes is that creativity is not just spontaneity. It needs structure. What do you mean?
What I'm addressing mostly is not creativity in the sense of learning how to paint or becoming, even though those two, I believe, need structure. But at any rate, I'm not talking about things that are creativity for personal expression and things like that, or poetry, or being a creative choreographer, even if you can think of that, a dancer. I'm talking about creativity in terms of thinking creatively. How do you reframe things? How do you look at things from a different perspective? How you open your mind to new possibilities? And then concretely, how do you build those possibilities into actual projects or products or organizational transformation, whatever? So, in that sense, creativity is a kind of a combination of two basic forms of thinking. One is what we call divergent thinking, which is kind of taking detours from the straight, the well-trusted straight route, the one that we all know and we take by default. So part of creative thinking is how to play with different angles, different perspectives, how to let things combine in unusual ways, what we call bisociation. But then you also need convergent thinking. You need to kind of make up your mind. You've explored all these new possibilities, you've opened new paths, and unless you converge, all you've done is played around. So, in order for something to be created, to become a reality, you need to go beyond just that, let's say, kind of spontaneous, exploratory, playful activity, which is essential. But you need also then to come back on the ground and to implement and to structure change. So just looking at that at a very, very basic level, creativity demands structure, demands, for example, the structure that lets you alternate between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. How do you open up and then focus, and open up and focus and implement? And design thinking, for example, there's one of the models of design thinking that expresses very well, called the double diamond model, which shows very clearly how design thinking is based on first an opening up, what we call the empathy phase, like really open mindedly examining what the client needs, what the pains are, without too many a prioris and ideas. You're really in the observation, and everything is possible, kind of. I want to be attentive to the world. I don't want to have my own judgments. So that is the beginning, in a way, of design thinking. But then there's a conversion phase where, from all the observations you've made, you have to focus in one or two which you identify as important problems to resolve. So, in that sense, I would say applied creativity, or creativity in context in which you're not just answering to yourself. It's not just your personal expression and development, but you want, in a way, to sell this to others. You want others to participate. You want others to buy your creativity. As soon as you get into that game, you need structure as well.
It's making me think too about, to your point, the other people that are involved in this process. And we're talking here specifically again in the applied creativity space, assuming you're working together or you're trying to get to something that you are building or implementing. I'm curious about, you mentioned some of the rules of creativity. Is a piece of what you're talking about with the divergent thinking, convergent thinking, is that connected to some of the rules, or can you expand on those concepts?
Definitely. Yeah. One of the key rules is don't mix up cognitive dynamics. Don't mix up, you can't put fire and water in at the same, and then you just get a lukewarm kind of result. So what you do in creativity is you make sure that when you're in divergent phase, you really are respecting that divergent phase, and you're not trying to be both expansive and thinking of possibilities and so forth, and at the same time, simultaneously, deciding whether that's realistic, whether it's good,
Yeah.
whether it's not good. In other words, bringing in the convergent logic. If you do that, then you're back to normal thinking. You're back to just our usual way of thinking, which we come up with a kind of a little idea that just gets a little bit further from the normal. And then we say, oh, no, but I can't do that. Oh, no, but that's too
Right.
expensive. Oh, no, 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 no. And so basically you're kind of going up and down like this. And so you stay in the nice lukewarm bath where everybody stays when they're just thinking in normal ways. So if you want to do something new, you have to give time to one phase and really give it a full push. And then you have to be just as disciplined and rigorous in giving time to another phase and being demanding for realism and practicity and so forth. This is kind of simplified version
Sure,
of what
sure.
happens, but it is an example of how you have to apply some rules if you want to get ahead.
So when you're talking about being, protecting the divergent before we go to convergent, I started to get examples in my mind of where I've seen that play out. But one connection point I was making is back to that idea of the dreamlike state, or well, I'm going to use that term for right now. I don't know the scientific term for where exactly you were speaking to, but for the purpose of this example, I'm wondering if it's kind of like as if you're in that dreamlike state when you're in divergent thinking. And if you pull it back, you wake them up. If you pull into convergent thinking, you kind of wake them up and they can't dream. Is that, I know
Yeah,
it's
it's
oversimplified,
not
but
bad. It's
yeah.
pretty good analogy. I didn't think of it like that, but it's pretty good. Yeah. In fact, these states, these very intermediate states, like the hypnagogic state, which is hypnagogic, it's Greek, of course. It's when you're going down into hypnos, into sleep. And the hypnopompic state is when you're coming out of sleep. Those are intermediate states. So they're very, very, how can I say it?
Fragile.
Yeah, they're changing. They're very fragile. You could there's something called lucid dreaming also, which is an intermediate state where you're dreaming and suddenly you become aware that you're in a dream. And this becoming aware can freeze things because suddenly you say, "Oh my God, I'm dreaming," and it's such a shock. You wake up, or the inverse, you have the insight, and then you just go back into the safe dreaming space where you're not aware that you're dreaming. So these kinds of fragile states are one of the intermediate states. They're very fragile, but they're also extremely rich because you're kind of at a meeting point between these very divergent states, which is dreamlike, and the convergent kind of, let's say, control-oriented state, which is our natural, prefrontal cortex taking over and say, put some order here. I don't
Right.
get what's going on.
Yeah. And I think the reason I was thinking about it in that way, it was helping me kind of consider why, when you're doing it with your eyes wide open, to your point, that protection is so important to keep you in
Yeah.
that state. And that's what took me back to thinking about dreaming.
There, what we replace, because it's not happening all in one person's head, we replace it with phases. We say, okay, first dream, let's say,
Yeah.
diverge, stop, converge, that kind of thing. We create a rule, especially when we're in teams, we're with several people, because if some people are diverging and having
Oh,
a good
yeah.
time and others
Or
are,
you burst your bubble.
yeah, they're bursting bubbles and then they get frustrated and they say what you're going off in a tangent and so forth. There's total miscommunication. So basically part of creating good brainstorming sessions is imposing rules, so to speak. And these rules are not always restrictive. Sometimes the rule is be free, so to speak,
Right.
and think freely and think in open possibilities.
Yeah, I think it's Priya Parker, The Art of the Gathering, that talks about the generous authority in rules, and she talks about how setting up pop-up rules or pop-up norms for
Yeah,
gatherings for specific purposes allows for that, depending on what the objective is.
sure. Yeah.
Mario, one of the things that you also spoke about in your notes was how accepting our limits can unlock this sense of urgency and clarity. You were speaking about limitations and potential. Potential isn't fixed, it can grow, but it can also shrink with inertia and routines. I think that was the piece I wanted to talk
Yeah.
about because
Okay.
I've said myself, potential is unlimited. And I like to think of it, that way. And I recognize we are limited humans. I just want to unpack that more. What do you think about that?
Well, let's say that I kind of burnt out with too much, like be your true self and live your passion. And you can always change even when you're 96, and you can always pursue a new whatever. And I think it's kind of like a bit too much out there sometimes to just convey that it's always possible to change. It's not always possible to change. We're not infinite. I mean, we're not eternal. We age. We're biological systems, and there are real changes that occur. Of course, we can do something about it. We can exercise, and we can eat the right food, and we can hyperventilate and get the oxygen to the brain. We can do all kinds of things, and we can feed a very powerful psychology. And it's proven, it's been shown with the Yale study on longevity that thinking positively about aging can have an objective impact on the number of years we live. So this is an amazing result. So it's definitely clear that we can have impact on things, but it's also clear that we may age well. We may age, we might get to 100, 110, 115, but we're not going to get to 800. Not, we're not going to get to 1,000. We don't have limitless time to do things, to wake up, to seize things. And as time goes on, the body, starts feeling a little bit more tired. I can say that from experience. We don't have the same zest and, energy that we had when we're 20. So it's just all to say that our potential is extremely, I think it's far greater than what most of us use. Far greater. And I can only be convinced of that if I'm convinced that certain phenomena like precognition or telepathy or psychokinesis occur. It shows that we don't really understand the limits of potential right now. The things happen. They're rare, but they do happen, and they've been established experimentally. Notwithstanding, majority opinion, they have been established experimentally. That sometimes we communicate with others at a distance. We influence matter at a distance, objects. It's rare, but it happens, and it just needs to happen once or twice under well experimental conditions to know that it happens. So it's clear that our potential vis-a-vis what we usually think is our potential, which is, for example, I think that in order to move an object, I have to touch it, right? Or I have to blow on it, or the heat from my body has to affect it. But some research is showing that I can affect it with intention, just intention. So some of the healing research shows this, psychic healing at a distance and things like that. But without getting into that, it's just that I'm not one that needs to be convinced that we have a huge potential. But I recognize that that potential changes with time, changes with biological changes, and we should be aware of it.
Yeah, you see on Instagram and online the stories of the entrepreneur at this age or that age. And I think there is something to helping people recognize potential and recognize opportunity for the purpose of
Yeah,
going for it. And I think in
absolutely.
this conversation, there's also something to, like, I believe two things can be true at the same time. I think also it's important to understand our limitations and our a sense of time urgency, because
Yeah,
I think we forget, especially in like younger age, that we are mortal, that we do
that's
have
right.
limitations. And
Exactly.
I think that in our American culture in particular, there is so much of this pressure of go do more. So as new technology comes out and is exponentially growing like it is right now, it's like, how do you use it to do more instead of like pause?
Yeah,
How do we use it to maybe work smarter and do a little less in certain areas so we can be present and be within our lives. And so I think I hear in some of the way that you phrased it, a sense of urgency to go for the experiments and try things. I've seen a lot of this in the Design Your Life work. I was part of a university class where I got to teach Design Your Life work
Cool.
last
Great.
semester at San Francisco Bay University, and it was a part of designing the course. We rolled it out in a beautiful way with students, and so got to see those lights turn on for them as they had some of these mindset shifts and things like that. And so, yeah, I think what I'm getting at here is this sense of urgency. So,
Yeah. I don't want to convey that there's a pressure to go out and get everything done
sure.
or kind of that. It's just kind of like maybe it's my own kind of getting gray that says, I'm just recognizing that there's a time for things that's optimal, and there's also an awareness. And that awareness is just don't always put things off for later on because you can do it anytime you please.
Yeah.
Or don't buy that myth, which is especially present in the United States, of, the just, you can,
Yeah.
break through any limits and so forth.
Right.
There are inspirational stories of people that break through what seem to be crippling limits. I mean, literally
Yeah.
amazing stories, but they're amazing because they're so rare
Right.
also. And still those people are going to progressively, they're going to age, and they're not going to be able to break through those things anymore after a certain time. So
Well, Mario, it's also making me think about, I think a lot of our listeners are, entrepreneurs, are people that are interested in continuing to grow and develop and learn. That's why they're listening to something about continuing to
yeah.
building thinkers and a lot of the guests that I have on. And so what would you say to people that are listening where they're like, okay, I hear you that there is this sense of limit in potential and yet possibility. How do I know what to go after? How do I know what to spend my time creating and building if I have, we use the term multi-potentialite. I have a lot of different possibilities,
Yeah.
and maybe I'm a high achiever and I get stuck a bit in the perfectionism of doing it right. And that's what keeps me waiting to ship it. Or what would you say to somebody like that?
This sense of a rhythm, a movement between, a more introspective life and a more externally oriented life is important. In other words, to know how to stop for a minute, get off the,
Real?
the wheel, and stop and just find a practice. It could be designing your life. It could be a meditative practice. There are lots of ways in which that permit you to go kind of and take stock of where you're at right now, get a kind of a helicopter view or a macro view, and put things into context, and then jump back in. But jump in with an experimenter attitude, an explorer attitude, and saying, okay, what came out of my compass, my inner compass for now, is that I need to go in this direction. I need to test this product, or I'm confident with this. On the other hand, I'm hesitant about that, so I'm going to put it on the side. Go with those intuitions, let's say, but that come from a real grounding of real awareness, and then do an experiment, because the idea is not to be attached to the result as much as to be attached to the process of discovery. And I mean, it's easy to say, it's difficult to apply, but this is part of the mindset shift: is enjoy the ride, in a sense, of trying things out and learning from experience, as opposed to saying this has got to work or else,
Right.
and kind of putting all your chips in there. So it's kind of, like I said, this rhythm of, again, having a time for yourself without distraction, so to speak, and then having a time to go out in the world, converge into something, but converge with an experimenter attitude, saying, I'm going to try this out and let's see what happens.
Mm,
And I'm going to get feedback. And then I'm going to learn from that.
right.
And that's going to help me adjust. And maybe I'll decide that even though I felt that this is the way, now I'm seeing the reality of things is that, it's not quite the way I thought it was. So what do I adjust? Do I drop it? Do I change? Do I start again? And so forth. So it's this kind of what we call agile process. It's learning by doing, but by adding this also this going within aspect. I think having these kind of life parentheses, uh, these moments when we create a little
I love that. Life.
private time is important.
Mario, the idea of these life parentheses, these pause moments, it was striking me as you were sharing that how vital this may be in this moment in time. Maybe it's always been, but it seems as if when everything is moving quite chaotically and fast, and there's again this kind of sense of more, or how do we make sense of this chaos here or there? A pause moment, a life parentheses, if you're feeling that sense of maybe overwhelm or how to make sense of things in the world, coming back to that internal, the introspection, the looking at what is in my compass. I find that,
Centering yourself. Yeah.
yeah, that centering then allows me to go forward into the world or into whatever I'm doing with a sense of that centering coming with me. And I've found, at least in my own internal work in this space, I think it makes me a better collaborator too, because I'm not so attached. Like, I can look back on Tracy even 5 years ago, much more attached to my ideas. Mostly now I recognize from a sense of perfectionism, not because I thought it was necessarily, it wasn't ego, but maybe in some way a sense of self-preservation. And now I hold things much more at arm's length to say, well, maybe this works, maybe it doesn't. Oh, I don't know about that. I'm not sure. That term that Mario said 5 minutes ago, I'm still trying to figure out how to pronounce that, but that's okay. Like, I don't need to be the expert in that because I don't have a PhD in that area. I can hear and listen and explore in a different way. And I think part of that is that mindset. Design thinking is a mechanism for that lets you practice the rhythm that you were talking about. And
Yeah.
then I find myself applying it all over the place, applying it to try to get my 10-year-old and 7-year-old to get along, and like trying different sentence stems with them or different environments to think about, help them build their compass.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mario, I'm wondering if we can talk briefly about what if someone wants to establish a creative practice in their life. Again, maybe they're an entrepreneur and they want to infuse more creativity and more humanness in the age of AI, when anyone can spit out a ton of new stuff or throw up an online course or this or that, but they're recognizing they want their human creativity to come out before they start anything. What would you advise people on the actual building of a creative practice in their lives?
A creative practice within a professional activity, or a creative practice as a kind of way of opening to creativity?
The latter.
It could be a hobby. It could be anything.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, to start with, I would say, what are you curious about? What are you attracted to naturally? And again, that might take some introspection, some centering, and say, well, what am I curious about? A lot of people maybe are just kind of rolling along,
right?
And the years go on, and they forgot what they were curious about. So it could take some digging up what used to turn them on, so to speak. And I would say that's one possibility. Another possibility is to, there are these little practices like, what is it called? The bucket. The bucket. What's your bucket list?
Oh, the bucket list. Yes.
Yeah. So, it's kind of harsh, but what are the things I want to do before I kick the bucket?
Yeah.
And that kind of is a way to zoom in on things that interest you, things that get you excited. Like a lot of people say, "Oh, I want to travel across the world." Okay, where? And get more specific about what fascinates you. Is it seeing all the cities in the world? Is it getting into the Amazon and where people are doing ayahuasca? Is it about going across the Atlantic or the Pacific in the boat? Well, so getting again, it's this whole thing about letting yourself dream and then get more concrete about it, get more specific about it. So again, I'm not talking necessarily about professional activities here. This
Right.
is more
Mhm.
for personally getting in touch. Also, you can look at what are the things that you like doing at a hobby level. I'll give an example of something I did not do and I regret. My daughter she's 20 years old and she's quite good in the cello,
Mhm.
quite good. And when we started, which was a long time ago, when she was 8 or 10 or whatever, it was nothing. It was like, da, da, da. It was like horrible to listen to. But she's become really good. And I'm saying to myself, now I love the cello. I mean, I love the sound that it puts out. I love the gesture, the jest that you do in doing it. Why didn't I start with it at the same time? Because I could have also, I could have, followed and so forth. And so there was something in me that was calling for that specifically. And it's kind of being attentive to those things because then those can become vehicles
Mhm.
for a certain form of creativity or a certain channel, so to speak, your love of music or your love of certain kind of depth because cello is very deep. It
Mhm.
resonates. It's a beautiful instrument. So that kind of thing. I mean, that's what comes on the top of my head.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. And I think, to your point about the life parentheses, like that pause allows you to have more of the attentiveness to notice what's going on. Whereas it's also easy to the point of inertia to shrink to just surviving each day and getting
Yeah,
to the next
sure,
day, which I think
sure.
many people are stuck in that, if you can even call it a rhythm, a just the repetition of that. And so I think that's where there's so much interest for people in things like design your life, in things where you pause. And again, I assume the listeners here are interested in things like we create thinktivities that go with each episode. And so I'm thinking, in our conversation of this creative practice that I could put something together from the conversation where you help people think about and consider. And so why would somebody want to do that? Why would somebody want to bring more creativity into their life? Well, a variety of reasons. But maybe what else would you say to that? Why should people care in the age of AI and we can, produce anything at our fingertips? Why does creativity still matter? Or maybe does it even matter in a different way now?
If it's creativity in order to invent a new coffee maker, if that's the creativity you're talking about, then the truth is probably we're going to have to delegate that kind of
Mhm,
stuff
mhm,
to smarter beings than us, which is AI basically, because sooner or later they're going to figure it out much faster and technically in extremely precise ways. And they'll be hooked up to all kinds of whatever industrial processes and so forth. So sooner or later, we're not going to need it then. Now, if we look at it in terms of individuals, something that makes us quite different from AI is experience and specifically what we call consciousness. But consciousness, if we don't want to get too academic about it, it translates to the fact that we live things and we're not just calculating things. We're living them fully. And that's, for now at least, that's clear that AI doesn't have a clue what that means.
mhm,
They can simulate things, AI and so forth, but they don't know what the inner experience is. So I would say that a reason for people to look into creativity is because creativity is touching at some fundamental gut level experience of bringing things into the world, of manifesting things, of being real. So when you're, if you, let's put it to extreme, let's make it like a caricature, as they say in French. If you become a robot, if you do the exact same thing day in, day out, you brush your teeth at the right time, you go to bed, you have your coffee, you say the same things every morning to your husband or to your wife, you take the same bus and all that, everything is perfectly on time and repetitive, then you can say that you're no longer experiencing life. You're just kind of coasting through life because there's nothing we get very quickly, and this is well known in cognitive psychology. If you do the same thing many times, you habituate to it, and it no longer attracts your attention. You look at the same thing. You look at an incredible. You hear a joke the first time, it's great. You hear it the second time, say, "Ah, that's a good joke."
But like
Third time,
driving
you're
a
not even
rental
listening.
car is harder because you're like figuring out where all the windshield wipers are and stuff because it's a rental car and it's different than your normal car.
Yeah. So the thing is, if you don't introduce that little spark of change and difference and surprise and contrast, then and all those provoke many forms of creativity. They're short term adaptations, they're short, but interesting. They open your eyes for a moment, they get you involved, and you start thinking, you say, what is that? Wow, that's interesting. And your mind starts going again. That's creativity. It's short, it doesn't lead to a product, but it's an expression of our humanness. So I would say that AI or not, if you want to be alive, you need to be in moving environments. You need to be in things that provoke awe or provoke surprise or curiosity and so forth, and that keeps you on your toes, so to speak.
What would you say if only people knew?
That all this is stories that we're living just by our internal narratives, that we're just telling ourselves stories, and that those stories are filtering and shaping our day-to-day experience. Stories about who we are, stories about what's good and what's bad, stories about what I like and I don't like. And some stories are useful and some stories may not be useful. And if only people could, I include everybody, myself first and foremost about that, if only people could kind of relativize, contextualize those stories and kind of once in a while lift above the story and see it in a more macro sense before they decide to plunge back in and either continue that story or eliminate it and just say that story isn't working for me anymore. Mm-hmm. So the story is that things never work out for me. The story is I'm so lucky in life. I'm so fortunate. The story that it never works out. You take those stories and of course they become self-fulfilling and, they're based on some evidence, but they're basically stories that have become fixed in our heads and they become like permanent ways of molding our day-to-day reality. So, like I said earlier, it's good to take a step back from time to time. That's one of the great purposes of meditation, of course, and of practices like Buddhism and so forth that are pretty strong in giving this kind of step back uh, mindset. That's why it's good to do that and to just have that protected space time to look at your stories and to look at them with a bit of a helicopter view and say, do I want to keep that?
Thank you. It has me thinking about, yes, if only you can, first of all, look at the stories. The story, I think Brene Brown popularized the stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And then I like the words that John Acuff uses. He has a book called Soundtracks. And so he talks about the mental soundtracks that we have.
Yeah.
And one of his positive soundtracks is things are always working out for me. And so he
It's
turns
great.
that one around that you just shared, and that once he calls it the pocket jury. The pocket jury will find evidence for whatever those soundtracks are. And so once we recognize them, we can rewrite them with the story we want to tell ourselves.
Yeah. Change
Um,
the jury.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Mario, thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Sure. Thank you too, Tracy.
Here's the thing, I think we're all trying to build something meaningful in our lives and with our lives. Mario pushed my thinking and made me rethink where my own limits are and how those limits might actually be creative constraints to help me move forward. If you want to keep reflecting on this episode, subscribe to the Building Thinkers newsletter, where I share a blueprint for thought to help you turn insight into action. And if this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone else who you think might enjoy it, or leave a quick rating or review. That helps more thinkers find their way here. And in the meantime, let's continue to build thinkers.